Good morning, everybody. We'll get started. My name's Lisa Salbutts. I'm from Cube HR, and I'm joined by Claire Thwaite from Cube HR as well. And we're just working this morning in partnership with Ainsworth's just to offer you a bit of advice around returning to work, coronavirus, our favourite topic at the moment, and quite a few different things. Claire is going to run the session this morning. What we'll do at the end, we'll open up for questions and answers. So there's two ways that you can get in touch with us. There's a chat function where you can message me privately, and we'll read your questions out at the end, but we won't say who it is. We'll just say we've had this question in so that you can remain anonymous. There's also a Q&A box as well where you're most welcome to raise your questions on there as well. So Claire's going to run the session. At the end, we'll open up for a Q&A. And between Claire and I, we will answer those. And obviously, you can see our website on there and things, and we'll give you our details so that if you've got any more questions at the end, we'll be happy to get in touch with you. So I'll pop myself on mute and I'll hand over to Claire.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, hi everyone, and welcome to our Return to Work webinar. So by the end of this session, we hope to have given you the tools you need to manage your people back to work over the next few weeks. Now, the government recently announced that all workplaces could start to return from the 1st of August, provided they've got the COVID-19 safety measures in place. So it's really important to plan ahead for this. I am going to record the session today. It'll only show me talking. Obviously, it's not going to show anyone else participating and the slides. And we will send you a copy of a link to the recording at the end. And we've also got a really handy return to work checklist that we can send out to you to use as well, or you can distribute to your team. As Lisa's mentioned, please do post your questions on the Q&A and we will return and answer them at the end of the session. So let's get started. So, today's session is to give you some of the key points of information to assist you in supporting your employees back to work, and we're going to be covering absences, so what to do if someone is off sick with COVID-19 symptoms and how to manage absence triggers. We're going to be covering the test and trace system, so what is it, what should you do if an employee is contacted by test and trace. We're going to be covering shielding, so an update on employees who have been shielding due to coronavirus. When can they return and what do you need to do? We're going to cover those reluctant employees. So what about the employees who are just too scared to return? They've got childcare issues, or some of them simply just don't want to come back. We're going to take a quick look at home working. So what do you need to consider for the future? We're also going to think about contract variations. So what happens if you need to reduce someone's working hours or their working pattern, or potentially reduce their salary for a short period of time? And lastly, we're going to look at the restructure and redundancy. So what happens when you need to make cuts? So we're going to start off here with absence. So as we're probably all aware by now, the main symptoms of COVID-19 is a high temperature. So you are hot to touch on your chest or back. So NHS guidelines suggest you don't actually have to take your temperature. It's just if you feel hot to touch on your chest or back. A new continuous cough. Now this is defined as coughing a lot for more than an hour, or 3 or more coughing episodes in 24 hours. And a loss or change to your sense of smell or taste. So you can't smell or taste anything, or things just smell or taste really, really different. If an employee is displaying any of these symptoms, they must self-isolate for a period of 7 days. And anyone in their household or support bubble must self-isolate for 14 days. If the symptoms do not persist beyond that time, or if the cough and the smell taste changes remain, but they haven't got any worse, they can return to work, and that's because the cough and the smell changes can actually hang around for quite a little bit of time after they're contagious. And please check in with your employees a couple of days before they're due back to find out how they are and to discuss their return to work. In addition to the self-isolation, anyone who has any of the 3 symptoms can now arrange a coronavirus test. So this is within the first 5 days of displaying symptoms. We are recommending to people that you ask your employees that report with symptoms to visit the NHS website and arrange that test. So the test can either be done at testing centres, or they can get a kit that they get at home. The tests on site take about 72 hours to come back. The home test kits obviously take a little bit longer because they're dependent upon the person actually sending them back swiftly. If your employee manages to get their test results back before that 7-day isolation period has ended, and provided that that test is negative, they can return to work straight away. So that's provided no one that they live with or anyone in their support bubble has symptoms. So if they're completely free of symptoms, everyone around them's free of symptoms, and their test is negative, they can come back to work. Again, follow up with your employees to ensure that they've arranged their test, and make sure that you take some time to discuss the results and their return to work. Now, obviously, if they're still feeling ill after that point, even if their test is negative, it might be wise to allow them to remain off so they don't pass any other bugs around. There are still a lot of summer colds and flus going around as well. And at present, any employee who has to self-isolate because they or someone in their household or their support bubble has symptoms, they are still eligible for statutory sick pay from day one of their absence. We recommend asking them to obtain a self-isolation note from the NHS 111 service, and that validates their absence for you. Again, I've mentioned the checklist. We are going to provide you with a checklist that will include some useful websites, and includes that one for you and your employees to visit. So in terms of absence management then, you might need to make some adjustments to your absence management policy. So I'm sure many of you have got policies in place, and you may have triggers in that policy, or you may be using something like the Bradford factor to monitor attendance. So we do recommend reviewing those triggers. For example, it wouldn't be appropriate to include COVID-19 related absences in your absence management triggers. That's because you do not want employees with symptoms attending work because they're too scared of facing disciplinary action. You will be putting their colleagues and your customers potentially at unnecessary risk. Where an employee is absent due to COVID-19, we recommend you do keep a record of that, and that you carry out your normal procedures. So that might be a return to work meeting with them or a discussion of some sort. But when you review your absence trigger points, discount the absence from that process. Please also remember to be considerate of other illnesses. I've just mentioned the summer colds and flu that are going around. We've all been kept away from the usual cold and flu bugs and the stomach bugs that make the rounds at the moment. So our immune systems are likely to be lowered in general. It's highly likely that you're going to see higher sickness absence rates for a while. So encouraging people to take time off and recover to avoid passing germs around their colleagues is definitely recommended. Follow your procedures for managing absence, but take this into account when deciding whether or not to issue that warning or to move for a dismissal, if that's what you would be looking at. Now, you may have employees who have lost family members or friends, either due to COVID-19 or due to something else. Returning to normal might cause more grief and distress for them, and they will need some time to come to terms with the new old normal. So be there to support them, and again, be sensitive to this when reviewing your absence triggers. This has been a really difficult period for most people in a variety of different ways, and it's highly likely that you're going to come across employees who are struggling with their mental health. Please don't be afraid to ask them, how are you, and to offer some support. There are a lot of ways that you can support employees through periods of poor mental health, and if they do need time off, it's really important that they don't feel pressured by potential warnings. It's also equally important that you stay in touch with them and take steps to help them maintain the routine of work. I've already mentioned the tests that are available for those displaying COVID-19 symptoms. Now, if as a result of that, the test comes back as positive, the NHS Test and Trace service will ask you for details of anyone you've had close recent contact with. So basically anyone you've been within 2 meters of for more than about 15 seconds. They will then contact those individuals. So if you have an employee who is contacted by the Test and Trace service, the procedure is that they will be alerted by the Test and Trace service, and they'll be asked to log on to the NHS Test and Trace website to review. They will be informed they need to isolate for 14 days from the last day of contact with the person who is tested positive. So it's not from the day they're notified, it's from the day of contact with that person. That would be on statutory sick pay for any period they can't attend work. And they might get notification from the Test and Trace service about it that they can provide as proof of absence, but if not, again, they can go and complete a self-isolation notification. They'll then be told to get a test, and if they develop symptoms, if that test is negative, they still have to complete their 14-day isolation period before returning. So unlike where we talked before, if your employee has a test and it is negative, they can return. For people who have been in contact with others and contacted by the Test and Trace service, they have to complete their 14-day isolation period before they can return to work, even if their test is negative. That's purely because of the incubation period of COVID-19. It could be possible for them still to develop symptoms 7, 8, 9 days on. And again, keep a record of any absences that relate to the Test and Trace service, but we're not counting them towards our absence triggers. So shielding employees. So what is a shielding employee? Well, this is the most vulnerable of people, essentially. This is people who have got serious illnesses, who have been told to shield for a period of 12 weeks. And the government have now announced that they will be able to return to work from the 1st of August. However, if they can work from home, it would be a good idea to still facilitate this for them, because naturally they're going to be quite worried about returning. Just because the government have said that they should return to work, it doesn't mean they're going to want to. It doesn't mean they are not going to be scared to do so or concerned about catching the virus. So what are your options at the moment with employees who have been shielding? Well, to some degree, that depends on what has been done with them during that period of shielding. So have they been on furlough or have they been on statutory sick pay? If they were on statutory sick pay, that entitlement is going to end on the 31st of July. So unless their GP signs them off as unfit to return to work, they're going to have to return, or they're going to have to take unpaid leave or use some annual leave. If they're on furlough specifically because they were shielding, that also comes to an end on the 31st of July, because the reason for furlough will no longer be there. So again, you'll need to explore those other options. But if they've been on furlough for other reasons as well, so they've been on furlough because they were shielding, but they've also had childcare issues, or you simply didn't have the work to sustain them anyway, they can then remain on furlough or flexible furlough until the scheme ends in October, provided you want to keep them on that. So it's definitely time to plan ahead. Start that conversation now with your employees who have been shielding. And this also applies to anyone who's been caring for someone who's been shielding as well. Get a plan in place for a safe and effective return to work. And this is where your return to work meeting is crucial. So for those who have been shielding, they're going to have been more socially isolated, probably, than most people. They may have poor mental health. They're obviously going to have felt quite anxious over the last few weeks. They may feel overwhelmed and unsafe to return to the workplace and really worried about catching the virus. You need to talk their concerns through with them. Share your COVID-19 risk assessment, and if you haven't done one, you must get one in place before workers return to the workplace. You may even need to amend that risk assessment to cover those shielding employees and any extra measures that you do have to put in place for them. Remember, it's highly likely that employees who have been told to shield will be classed as disabled, and you're obliged to consider all reasonable adjustments to help them return to work. If they have to take public transport to work and back, consider how you can help them with this, as they might be really reluctant to get on the bus. But the only thing you can do other than that is then encourage your employees to consult with their medical team. So if they're still worried about returning, despite all the support you've put in place, they need to consult with their medical team, because they will be the best people to advise them as to how they should proceed going forward. Now, it's quite likely that you're going to be facing a range of objections from your employees about returning to work. Some of you may already have started having these conversations. The biggest one of these is, of course, going to be employees feeling nervous, anxious, or just downright scared about returning. It's really important to make sure you carry out those return to work meetings with every employee so that you can discuss their concerns, alleviate them where possible, and come up with a plan of action if they're still not convinced about returning. So your return to work meetings should cover things such as, how do they feel about returning? Are they anxious? Are they excited? What safety measures have you put in place for them? So again, going back to that COVID-19 risk assessment we've just mentioned, be specific about what you are doing, what they need to be doing, and how they raise concerns if safety procedures aren't being carried out. Have they got any other issues that are making them reluctant to return, such as childcare, not wanting to take public transport, or maybe a shielding relative? It's also a good idea to get them thinking a little bit about the return to work and about their past experiences over the past few months. So what have they missed about being in work? And what have they enjoyed about being at home? Just encouraging them to think positively about both parts of that experience. You need to talk to them about their mental health. So how is their mental health? How will they tell you if they are not okay? So everybody needs handling differently. Make sure your team feel comfortable opening up to you if they've got a problem. And talk to them about the plans for the future. If you've had team on furlough, they are very likely to feel nervous about the future of the business. There's lots of talk out there at the moment about very, very big companies having to make redundancies, and they are going to feel anxious about what's going to happen. Reassure them where possible, discuss those plans for the future and how you're going to get back to full operations, and be honest with them. So if it is looking like you may need to think about redundancies, do be honest with your team about that. Don't pretend everything's okay and then spring it on them out of the blue. At the moment, if your employee still has childcare issues because their school or nursery just simply isn't open, they are still eligible to remain on furlough. And now, if their school or nursery is open and they're choosing not to send their child back, that's a different matter. And you will need to discuss this with them and try to reach an agreement. And once you've gone through all of this with your employee, you've offered them support, you've showed them how you'll keep them safe, you've dealt with their objections, you've agreed a return to work plan, hopefully they'll feel much less anxious about coming back. But if you're still having problems after this, please reach out to your HR support or to ourselves or to somebody that you know and trust that has knowledge of HR for some guidance, because there are a few different options for resolving those instances. We know that home working has increased by a massive 38% throughout COVID. So employers who have never ever considered it an option before have been forced to embrace that concept of home working. And you might find now that your employees have got used to working from home, or maybe they prefer the work-life balance that their recent flexible hours have given them in that case. So you might find you're going to get some flexible working requests. Now, everyone has the right to apply for flexible working, provided they have 22 weeks service with you. In their flexible working request, they should explain why they want to change their working pattern or their location, and how they feel that this will impact on themselves, their workload, and the team as a whole. Now, you do need to consider these requests carefully, but you can say no, provided you have a legitimate business reason for doing so. You don't have to agree to it. We're massive advocates for flexible working, for any of you that might have seen our videos or blogs, and we encourage our clients to be as flexible as work allows. But there is also a place for having people come together as part of a team, and having everyone work from home can create its own challenges, so it does need careful consideration. The biggest fear that we find that employers have got about allowing employees to work from home, usually based around trust. So how do I know they're not just watching Netflix all day? And of course, we can deal with that if that happens. Do take the time to consider your employees' requests. So consider them in full. Take a quick review of how working from home has impacted them during the past few weeks. So were they productive? Did they stay in touch? Did you feel confident that the work was getting done? If they've been rubbish and they've really not met any of those criteria, it's probably not a good idea to allow them to work from home as a long-term thing. But if they have met your requirements, or they've exceeded those requirements and actually been more productive, which is often the case, then why not consider a more permanent arrangement? If you do agree to a home working arrangement, you'll need to make sure you carry out a home working risk assessment. And you also need to come up with an agreement as to who's going to pay and provide any equipment that they need. So if they need a new monitor, they need a new chair, who's going to pay for that? Who's going to provide it? Who's going to own it? You also need to have a think about the security of your data and any monitoring or check-ins that you actually expect from them. So do you expect them to call into the office once a week, once a month, once every day? How do you want them to check in with you? Ultimately, both you and your employee need to feel comfortable with whatever it is you agree on. Now, whenever you need to change the terms of an employee's contract, you have to follow a fair process. And this includes notifying the employee of the proposed changes and the reasons behind them, asking for their consent, and then acting accordingly. The key to contract variation is in the communication. How well you deliver your explanation to your employee to start off with. If you explain things properly, hopefully your employee will understand, and they may be happy to sign their new contract. So you would then confirm that in writing, getting them to sign their agreement, and that's everything done. But if an employee won't agree to vary their contract, despite having a valid rationale, you need to attempt to resolve their objections. So at this point, you would arrange a meeting with them to discuss their concerns, answer their questions, consider the solutions where possible, and give them a bit of time to think about it. Now, you probably want to back this up with an email or a letter outlining the discussion and asking for them to consider again signing that new contract. Then you need to hold a follow-up meeting to see if you can finalise things. It's always better to try and work with the employee where possible to come to an agreement that suits you both. And also you need to be clear if this is a temporary change or a permanent change. But there are times when an employee just simply will not agree. Those employees will need to be invited to a formal consultation meeting and advised that they may be dismissed and offered re-engagement on new terms. They will have the right to be accompanied at this stage. Now, it can get pretty complicated, and there is a high risk of unfair dismissal claims and potentially discrimination claims at this point. So please, again, do seek advice from your HR team before you confirm any dismissal. And lastly, restructuring and redundancy. So if you're considering restructuring and the possibility of making some redundancies, you have to make sure you have a clear rationale behind what you're doing and that you follow a fair selection process. Now, we get asked a lot about using redundancy as a way to remove underperforming or poor employees from a business. And this is not a legitimate or legal reason for redundancy. Redundancy has to be about the role. So there are 3 legal reasons for redundancy, which are that the employer has ceased or intends to cease business, that the work the employee carries out has ceased or diminished, or you expect it to do so, or that the need to carry out that work at the specific location has ceased or diminished, or is expected to do so. Now, sometimes a redundancy process can be really straightforward. You've got one employee doing one role in one location, and you just don't need that role anymore. But if you've got a team all doing the same role, you need to follow a fair selection process. So let's think about a sales team as an example. You've got 10 sales guys who operate in the Northwest. They have kind of individual areas that they work in, but those areas do overlap, and in reality, each of them could cover any area. You've decided you need to reduce your staffing costs because your sales team are costing too much money and they're not bringing enough revenue in. You need to make cuts. You've done your figures and you know you can manage with a team of 8 going forward. And this will ensure that all areas of work are still covered and there's enough work for everyone, and it will make it easier for your remaining sales team to hit their targets. It's tempting to look at some of the more traditional methods of selection, so last in, first out, or well, your face doesn't quite fit, so it's you, or you're the youngest. But each of these methods is really flawed. So what if by using last in, first out, you get rid of your one superstar sales guy because he was the last person that joined your company? Or what if you end up facing an age discrimination tribunal because you chose the youngest or maybe the oldest? And this is where a scoring matrix comes in. So choosing 6 to 8 criteria, maybe based on things like skills, qualifications, ability, performance reviews, did they hit their targets, what's their attendance like? As long as it's measurable and fair, you can choose the most appropriate of these selection criteria. And then once you've put your employees at risk of redundancy, you need to share that selection matrix with them and ask if they think that that's fair. You would then score your employees individually. Now, it might be worth getting more than one person involved in this process if that's not breaching any confidentiality, just to make sure that you are being completely fair and neutral. Complete the scoring and see what happens. And obviously the person or persons who are your 2 lowest scoring people, or maybe the highest, depending on which way around you've done your scoring, those will be the 2 that have then been identified for redundancy. And at your next consultation meeting, you would then discuss the score with them, ask if they agree, obviously deal with any questions, and you can then notify those 2 employees that they are actually confirmed as being redundant. And don't forget to notify the others that they are no longer at risk and have retained their employment. When you're planning your redundancy process, you need to bear in mind that there are some formal consultation periods that are limited in time. So if you are making more than 20 redundancies, you have to consult for a minimum of 30 days before dismissal. And that actually increases to 45 days if there's more than 100 redundancies to make. For fewer than 20 redundancies, there's no official consultation length. We generally advise approximately 2 weeks, although in some really simple situations that can be shorter. It's worth bearing in mind as well, if your employees are on furlough, you can still claim the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme money for notice pay, provided that is working notice and not pay in lieu of notice. There was a little bit of talk a while back that that might not be possible, but it actually is. The government have confirmed that that is actually correct. So it's definitely worth planning ahead for that, so you can try and reduce your overheads as much as possible. And you can also enforce annual leave during the notice period as well, even if they're on furlough. So provided you've given them the right notice, which is double the amount of time you want them to take off. So if your employee has got a week's leave accrued, give them 2 weeks notice to take that leave, and they can take that within their notice period. It's worth just mentioning though, for the notice period and the holiday pay, you do have to pay them 100% of their pay, although obviously you can reclaim the 80% back. We really recommend that you keep any employees on furlough for as long as reasonably possible before making them redundant. The scheme was set up as a way to avoid redundancies initially, so it's only fair and right to use it in the spirit that it was intended. So at the end of July, so at the end of this month, you will start to incur some small costs. Basically, it's just the fact that you can no longer reclaim your employer's national insurance and pension contributions. When you get to September, you're then looking at having to contribute an extra 10% towards the wage, and in October it'll be 20%. So you need to consider how much you can afford and get the timing right to be as fair and reasonable as possible. And don't forget, when you're going through a redundancy process, that reputational damage can be just as bad as the legal recourse of getting it wrong. So redundancies are never pleasant. If you handle them well and you support your employees, you can hopefully avoid them telling the world what an awful place you are to work. If you don't believe that this can happen, then just think about the backlash that places like Sports Direct and Wetherspoons have had in the recent way that they've treated their staff. I'm going to stop waffling on now. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it informative. I'm going to hand over to Lisa now to have a look at the questions that have come in. And if you've got any other questions, please do feel free to bounce them on the Q&A or on the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. A lot of information there. That was really, really informative, and hopefully we've answered a lot of questions for people. We've got a couple of questions coming, so I will go to those in a minute. But if anyone else has got things in the head, you can either put it on the Q&A or you can put it privately on the chat to me, and we'll answer them. The first question that we got in was about the recent changes to Spain, what's happened in Spain and the quarantine rules. So yes, travel agents everywhere. I know a lot of people in travel just when they thought it couldn't get any worse. So the questions were the latest rules about the 14-day quarantine for Spain and what pays an employee entitled to during quarantine. So because it is a government directive, they would be entitled to statutory sick pay for that 14-day period. And because it's due to coronavirus, you could claim that back as an employer through your, how you claim your things back. Sorry, get my teeth in. So yeah, there is some lobbying going on that some of the like the Balearics and Canaries to be exempt because they're not seeing a rise in cases there. But it's just watch this space. But at the moment, anybody who comes back would need 14 days. If your employees can work from home, that they could work from home while they're quarantined. It's just that they can't leave their house. So if they can work, get them working from home, and then obviously they would attract their usual pay. And the other question relating to that was, really good question, can an employer refuse an employee to take future holidays? Now it's known they'll need to quarantine on their return. Okay, so there's a legal and then there's an ethical answer to this question. So I will talk to you about the legal one first. So under Regulation 15, you can cancel your employees' holidays, and there is two arms to Regulation 15. So there's when you want to enforce holidays, which I'll talk about again in a minute because that's the other question that we've had in. But if an employee has a week off booked, if you want them to cancel that, you have to give them the same amount of notice. So if they've got 5 days booked off, you would have to give them 5 days to cancel that, okay? That is the legal position. However, if you did do that and they had a holiday booked and they're then out of pocket, I think that they would have an argument that you have breached the implied term of trust and confidence in that relationship. So they could resign, potentially claim unfair dismissal, they could raise grievances, and it's a really, really tricky situation. I would say that if employees haven't already booked holiday and they come to you wanting to book time off to go to Spain, that would be a less risky refusal rather than asking people to cancel if they've already got something booked. So like I say, there's a legal answer to it and there's also an ethical answer to it. Claire, anything that you'd want to add to those before I go to the next question?
No, I think that pretty much covers it at the end of the day. Like you say, it's really tricky if an employee's already paid out on a holiday and then you turn around and say you can't take that holiday, who's liable for reimbursing them for that money because you've already approved it and authorised it, so it's really tricky.
Yeah, and there's some commentary out there because when this happened, we go and do our own research and reading, and there's lawyers out there saying, in 20 years of practice, they've never known employers cancel a holiday that's been booked and paid for and believe that the individuals will have strong cases. So you can bet your bottom dollar if it happens, they'll be on Google, they'll find these articles and they'll start suing. So tread with caution. And I'd always say, like we say with everything, with things like this, take advice from your own HR practitioner. If you don't have one, reach out to us and ask. We're happy to answer questions like that. So it is tread with caution. And the other question that we've had in is it's still about holidays. So just saying, can you just reiterate the enforcing holidays rule. So Claire mentioned, again, it's the same regulation, it's regulation 15, but it differs when you're asking your employees to take holidays. So whether they're in notice or not, the regulation is the same. It's regulation 15 of the working time regulations. If you want to force your employees to take holidays, you have to give double the notice. So if you're asking them to take holidays back from them, you've just got to give the same notice. But if you're wanting them to take holidays, you have to give double. So for example, if I wanted Claire to have a week off work, I would need to give her 2 weeks notice to tell her I'm going to take 2 weeks off work. Where this has proved useful is for people who are on furlough. So if you've got employees who are still on furlough and they're due to come back and you think, crikey, they've still accrued all this annual leave during that period, you could give them double the notice to take those holidays whilst they're on furlough. And the beauty of that is, although you have to pay them 100% of their normal salary, you can claim 80% back, obviously up to the maximum threshold that's been set, but you can claim that back. So the cost to you, you know, it could be as little as 20% of their salary. And the other time that regulation is useful is if you are in the unfortunate position of having to make redundancies, you can enforce holidays in the notice period. So if somebody was on a month's notice and they had a week's annual leave accrued, in normal circumstances, you'd have to pay them the notice and pay them the week on top. Whereas here, you can give them, because you've got time to give them double the notice, you could say that the last week of their notice period is actually annual leave. So you save a full week's pay and you're still able to claim that week's notice on the furlough scheme as well, so reduces your costs further. It can be quite complicated, so again, you know, if you're going through things like that, feel free to talk to your own HR provider or ask us. So is it, that's the only questions that we got in. If anybody's got any more that they want to ask, feel free to pop them on the chat or in the Q&A. Just while we give that a couple of minutes, you all had to provide us with your emails when you registered for the webinar. So the return to work questionnaire stroke checklist that Claire mentioned, we will email that out to you together with a link to be able to download the recording, and also for those people who weren't able to join us this morning that registered as well. So okay, well, if there's no more questions, thank you for your time, and thanks, Claire, that was really good, and thanks to Mark and the team at Ainsworth's for working with us to be able to provide you with this webinar. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, we've just got another question come in. Okay, another question. So, if you have one person in a role and the work they do is diminished, does the redundancy process consist of purely a one-to-one meeting where you explain the reason, offer them the notice period? No, it's not quite that straightforward. If that person had under 2 years, it could be, because they don't have the right to claim unfair dismissal. But if they are over 2 years, there has to be a period of consultation. Now, because it's under 20 people, there is no specification in law as to what that consultation period should look like. But if you met somebody, had a one-to-one meeting, explained the reason, and then gave them their notice, that's not consultation, because you've not allowed them to bring anything up. So we always suggest 3 meetings. The first meeting would be where you put them at risk of redundancy. So, hi, such a person, because of COVID, the work's reduced, you know that there's not the work there, you've seen it because of X, Y, and Z reason. I understand that this is a shock, but you are at risk of redundancy. I'm going to meet you again in a couple of days to see if you've got anything that you want to put forward. You meet them again in a few days. Now they've had time to think about it, is there anything else that they want to put forward? Have they got any information they want to give you about how to mitigate the need for the redundancy? They may or may not have. And then after that meeting, you send them a letter inviting them to a final consultation meeting, give them the right to be accompanied. And it's in that meeting where you'd say, look, unfortunately, you haven't been able to come up with anything, and nor have we, to mitigate the need for the redundancy. So you are redundant and your notice will start today or in a period of time, whatever that might look like. So that's the minimum that we would recommend, just because if you did get taken to a tribunal for unfair dismissal, they will ask you to show that you had meaningful consultation. So by having those few meetings, you would be able to show, and you can still get that done in a week to 2 weeks, you know, you're not adding lots of time, and it just means that you can stand up in tribunal with confidence to say that you allowed that individual the opportunity and time to come up with anything that they wanted you to take into consideration to mitigate the need for the redundancy.